Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue: what is the effect on real estate prices, whether it be mortgages or rentals, of mass migration, but also mass students? Now, Australia gets, something in the order of 500,000 a year recently. Of people are coming in to Australia primarily from places like India, and there are entire swathes of Sydney now that are just Indian. You don't see a white person there. Even in downtown Sydney, it is frequent when I'm travelling around there that I'm the only white person in the train carriage or the bus. The only white person in downtown Sydney, Australia. When I go to Singapore, an Asian city on the equator, there. When I go to Singapore, there are more white people in downtown Singapore than there are in downtown Sydney, Australia. That just illustrates the extent of the people movement. But in addition to sort of the mass migration, there are also large numbers of foreign students coming. Now, some of them come from other white countries, but not very many. The majority of students that come to Australia are from places like India and China and other brown or black countries, primarily brown. And now you get a small number of, for example, Japanese students, but the minute their studies are over, they go back to Japan. So the issue is third world students coming in. They don't want to go back. As far as they're concerned, that money they've paid for their study fees to the university, that's equivalent to the down payment for a passport, citizenship passport. That's their perception of how things work. Nor are they coming for an education, especially the wealthier members of those societies, the Brahmins from India, for example, or the offspring of corrupt Communist Party generals in China. They're not coming for an education, far from it. As far as they're concerned, it's a vanity project. They've paid the big bucks for the tuition, and they expect that fucking bit of paper at the end of it. And what we're paying for isn't for an education. We're paying for that bit of paper. Again, a bragging rights, prestige, vanity project exercise. And there are many that walk out with PhDs that still can't speak a word of English at the end of it. But I want to again focus on the effect on rental and mortgage property prices, residential property prices generally. If we go back sort of 20 years, the amount of properties for rent, and I'll use that as the sort of a baseline for the moment, but the amount of properties for rent was nearly 3 times, in fact more than 3 times what it is today. If we go back sort of around 10 years in time from today, the amount of properties for rent was just over double what it is today. So the amount of property for rent has fallen by about 57%, give or take. Say 60. We're going to round the numbers up. So that's quite a fall. Now, over that time, supposedly, hundreds of thousands of new properties have been built, and most of it apartments, and many of those apartments put up, not all, but many of them put up for rent. But somehow the amount of properties generally, whether it be for sale or rent, and again, I'll use rental as the baseline for the moment, the amount of properties for rent has gone downhill, has been reduced, gone downhill by leaps and bounds. Now, given the amount of new stock entering the market for rental, how is it that the number of properties for rent have gone down so much? In the most populous city in Australia, Sydney, populous by far, the amount of properties for rent is, it's insane. It's such a low level of rentals. It's difficult. A lot of those are freestanding houses that are quite expensive. Where the rent's a couple of $1,000 a week plus. So I wanted to really, look at is property responding to what we would call market forces, that is supply and demand, which is the claim that's bandied about by all the propagandists. So because all the propagandists are sticking doggedly to that talking point, then you know it's probably not true or even remotely true. But also to look at how supply and demand only works one way. It only works to inflate prices of property, never to stop that inflation or to cause decreases. And this is the big thing. So are we talking about an actual market here? Are we talking about a insider-controlled money laundering machine? Are we talking about that when it comes to residential real estate? Because I think we are. Now, when COVID struck, something in the order of 1.5 million plus people from India and China and places like that went back to India and China from Australia. And so you would think, given the amount of those people that were renting, you would think that the rental market would collapse in terms of rents. So at the time, Australia-wide, there was, say, 95,000, give or take, 95,000 properties for rent. And so when all this 1.5+ million, I don't know exactly how many, is 1.5 million plus, so more than that. When they all went back, so they all left Australia and went back to, and they were gone for a couple of years, went back to India and China and Philippines and wherever else, that the price of real estate, rental real estate, didn't actually go down. It went down like 2 or 3%. There were some things that where property owners would say offer the first week's rent for free if you signed up for 12 months. There was a bit of that going around, but they were only in areas where you had those forests of high-rise apartments. Only there did you see that, not outside of it, and it was again fairly rare. So, but when you look at the amount of properties that were for rent, declared on the rental online rental sites, the amount of properties for rent actually went down. So 1.5+ million people go back to the third world from Sydney, from Australia, and yet the amount of properties for rent declined. Now, how is that even possible? So the rental market was almost cut in half when those people went back. So there should have been tens of thousands of properties up for rent, but instead the amount of rental properties declined. So fewer properties for rent, even though 1.5 million renters had left Australia, there were fewer properties to rent. Now that can't happen in a market-driven economy. There should have been, the amount of properties for rent. Even if you say that the amount of people were living 10 people to an apartment, for example, which would be not far off the money. The wealthier people, of course, don't live for those numbers, but the less well off live that. I've seen 2-bedroom apartments that have 17 Indians living in 17 Indians in a 2-bedroom apartment, and that's illegal, but it's widespread, and the local authorities always look the other way to these sorts of things, as indeed do the real estate agents and the property owners. Again, it's illegal across the board, but no one seems willing to enforce it. So even if you do that would mean that there'd be, say, between 15 and 20,000 properties would suddenly come up for rent. Minimum 15 to 20,000 properties would come up for rent when those people departed. So the stock would go from 100,000 to 120, 125,000, and would have a dramatic effect on reducing rents, assuming these people needed to rent the properties. But instead, the amount of rental properties fell in half. So this meant that if you look at PARSE, you pass the numbers, that means that something in the order of 50, give or take, 50,000 properties were being rented by overseas people. And when they left, none of those properties needed to be rented out. Were these people actually paying rent at all? How is it that 50,000 property owners suddenly decided they've lost their tenants, but they don't need any rent? Yet they don't need to have a rental income coming in. Again, that's not market forces. These are people that own the properties outright or engaging in some sort of tax scam. Are they owned by labour hire firms who are illegally importing workers? Are they owned by scam colleges? What's going on here? But this, in market forces, that can't happen. When you lose all your customers, you need to then go out and have the tenants. That is, you need to go out and rent those properties, and you're prepared to accept if you're an owner that needs an income, a property owner that needs a rental income, you've got to rent it for whatever price you can get, which is how things used to work, by the way. But for some reason, the amount of properties were cut in half for rental, and you had 50-odd thousand properties, give or take, and 50-odd thousand rental properties where the owners of those properties did not require a rental income. So we're not talking market forces here, nothing of the sort. Now, when I was a kid, first young man, first renting, market forces played a big role. When you were trying to rent in an area that was popular, you paid a higher rent. You went to rent in an area that was less popular, less access to facilities or, less transport connections, these sort of things. The difference in rent was obvious. And, if I wanted to inspect a property, the real estate agent would meet me at the property. Bear in mind, I'm like a young punk here. And the real estate agent, they were so keen to rent properties, that the owner of the property needed a rental income. And so the real estate agent would meet me at the property to do an inspection. Do you want to go now? When would you like to meet Mr. Billy Bob? Tomorrow morning, sir. Fine, I'll be there. I mean, you could name the time. You could name the day and the time. They wouldn't quibble with you. Nah, not available that day. Sorry, buddy. They would meet when you were ready to meet. That was how it was. And have a look at the property. If they thought you were interested, they would say, look, the rent's back in the day, the rent's $30 a week, $40 a week, whatever it was. And but look, if you're interested, I can give you $5 a week off, or which was $10 a week off. So you could easily get 10 or 20% reduced off the rent just by talking to the agent on the spot. So one place I got walk to the beach, walk to the shops type place, and I got a generously spacious 2-bedroom apartment, fully furnished, TV, the whole 9 yards, everything there, nice, generously sized refrigerator. Got the whole thing for $40 a week. That's how it was then, and they were, almost begging me to fucking rent it. All that's changed, of course, now, but that was a day time when rentals were market driven. The market decided it. Could you afford to pay? If you can't afford to pay the amount we'd like, we'll give it to you for less. We just need your rental income. But none of that happened during COVID. It just didn't happen. Even though people were, a mass swathe of renters were leaving the supposed rental marketplace. It didn't matter. Rental prices didn't really go down because the properties for rent, the products were withdrawn from the market in a mass level. It was a mass withdrawal of rental properties from what could have been or otherwise was or hitherto a marketplace. So we're looking at a very, very insider controlled thing where market forces are not operating, only market demand increasing, which causes increasing. It's only one way, and it continues to this very day to have just a one-way effect on property prices generally and rental prices. So an investigation of some magnitude is required here as to why market forces are not functioning and why there's only a one-way trajectory for prices. And even if prices stall for a few months, that's all that happens before they take off again. So I would argue there's an artificial shortage here that's been created by an insider-controlled money laundering machine. Now, the same could be said for things like property for sale, as in buying a residential property. The claim, various charts and graphical representations and statistical analysis are sort of floating around the internet where it's claimed that in the late 1990s, I'll use Australia here as the baseline, in the late 1990s, builders, house builders, home builders, government releasing land for land development and so on, that suddenly took a sharp downturn. So if we look at this, it appears to be coordinated. that the government, the government owns a lot of land, and so they release land for sale, but they release it very slowly. They always want a shortfall. They want to get maximum return and price, so they wait until demand is exceeding supply before they release another section of land. It could be an estate with 500 house building blocks of land on it, but they release these slowly and pass all the costs of the land, the parks, the roads, the curbing, the guttering, the stormwater, everything is passed on to the property developer. This used to be something that the government paid for, and sometimes it was done slowly, like that. There wouldn't be curbing and guttering put in straight away. There'd be septic tanks instead of sewer. There wouldn't be parks and so on that were put in, and the street lamps would be spaced quite far apart, and so on. So, but now all those services are put in, which means that comes up to something like $200,000 a block with all the on costs for the other services. The property developers paid a premium price for land, has to add another, $250,000 to the cost of the land development, so it has to decrease the size of the land. So the 750, 800 square yard block has now become a 350 square yard block, and where the houses touch each other and all that sort of stuff, even if it's in the outer suburbs. So very different cost structure for property and land development than it used to be, with the government actively participating in creating or allowing demand to outstrip supply. But going back to the numbers here, it's argued that, or based on looking at the numbers, in the late 1990s, just as mass migration was starting to kick off in the early 2000s, there was a sharp reduction in the amount of building that was going on, residential home building or apartment building. A very sharp reduction came. Now that reduction came at the exact time that mass migration was kicking off. Now those two events, put them together. Well, hold on a minute. You're reducing the supply at the same time as you're jacking up the demand. I mean, what? Now this can't be an accident or a coincidence. And I think it was the beginning of an insider-controlled artificial marketplace with it's supply and demand. No, it's not. You're artificially restricting supply and artificially pumping up demand. And when you lose that demand, like at COVID, when all those millions of people went back to India and China, you just suddenly dramatically reduce the supply, in this case of rental properties. But the same could have been said for residential properties. The supply of residential properties for sale dropped down. And on top of that, people were prepared to sit on their properties for years if necessary to get the price that they want. That doesn't happen in a market-driven economy. It just doesn't happen. People have to sell it. They got a property for sale, they have to sell that property, and to make the number of times I've bought another property while I've had a property for sale, and so I've had to get bridging loan and bridging finance, which is only exist for a certain time window, and then it kicks in. You have to pay 2 mortgages. So most people, myself among them, would have struggled to do that with all the other expenses, school fees and whatever. So I just had to sell the property. And if I wanted $100 for the property I was trying to sell, but I could only get $95, I had to take the $95. It wasn't a matter I had choice or I could hang on indefinitely. That's not the same now. The owners of properties now consider that. There's a guy not far from here, and he put his property for sale up for about 14 months ago. He wanted a very optimistic price, and he hasn't got any takers. And I was talking to him, why are you? It's over a year now, for goodness sakes. Oh, no, I don't have to sell. No, I'm hanging out for the price I want, and that's it. No, I don't know whether he actually owns it or he's fronting for other people or what, but whether it be in the case of the rental, whether the property owner doesn't need a rental income, or the property owner trying to sell their property doesn't have to sell, they can just take their time. 100 years they'll sit on it, and so the amount of time that a property sits unsold stretches out sometimes, as I say, to over 12 months. Now, in normal market conditions, that never happens. They've just got to sell it. So I would argue we're just not dealing with a market here at all, and no natural market forces. And whatever forces are allowed to be at play only to drive prices up and nothing else. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.